Hi, I'm Lindy Goodall from Lindy G Embroidery, and today we're going to quilt in the hoop. In a previous video I showed you how to piece a block in the hoop. This quilt was actually quilted in the hoop, and then I pieced it together using a quilt as you go technique. Now this quilt shows the 12 larger versions of the designs on the It's a Girl quilt. There are also 12 smaller ones for small sewing fields. Now one thing to keep in mind when you quilt in the hoop, the back of the quilt tends to not look as neat as if you're quilting with a quilting machine or your sewing machine. So if we look at the back of this, you might be able to see that there are some knots showing, and the closer your thread blends into this back fabric, the less you're going to see that kind of thing. So what I did was I matched my bobbin thread to my top thread. So I just wound some extra bobbins and I used embroidery thread in my bobbin. Now another thing while we're looking at the back of this quilt is I've put a little label down here. It's going to be kind of sideways for you guys, but I've just pieced that in, and I've just used a lettering program on my computer to create that. So you might want to do that too. In this test piece, you can see that I've used the same color thread on white, and here it's even more noticeable how messy the back is. If you're using a quilting design in the hoop, it's more than likely going to be continuous, but these are redwork designs and they have lots of individual elements, and those elements can't be connected, so you're going to have tie-offs. If your machine has automatic thread trimmers, it's going to pull those threads to the back and they're going to be noticeable. Now in this little sample, I've used a different fabric on the back and you can't even see the design. So if this kind of thing bothers you, just pick a really busy fabric and make sure that your thread blends in really well, and no one will ever see that. Now the smaller designs will fit the smaller hoops, and what you're going to do is just hoop your fabric. You're going to make your quilt sandwich. So I have my backing fabric, my batting, and my top, and I'm just going to do the embroidery. If you have a larger machine, these were embroidered in an 8x8 hoop, even though the actual design will fit in a 5x7 hoop. There are some utility files, and this is just a double basting run. The first one you're going to sew directly on your stabilizer. So here I've hooped some water-soluble stabilizer. I just run that basting stitch. It shows me exactly where I need to place my quilt sandwich. I spray the back of my quilt sandwich with a temporary embroidery spray adhesive, smooth it into place, and run that stitch again. Then all I need to do is load in my extra design. So in a hoop, a 5x7 hoop, you could sew the designs, the full-size designs without the utility block, or sew the smaller ones with the utility block. The nice thing about the utility block is you can use much smaller fabric pieces. If I didn't have something like this, or you can't baste in your hoop, you're going to have a quilt sandwich that's big enough to hoop all the way around, and that's going to use a lot of extra fabric. Now I mentioned that I used a quilt as you go technique, and once you get all your blocks made, you're going to trim them to size. And I've used the basting line as a guide. Be sure to measure, because the fabric can distort while it's sewing, and you want to make sure that all of your blocks are exactly the same size. The advantage of quilt as you go is that you don't have to worry about messing up something really big. You're only working on small little blocks. So the next trick is, how do you piece those together? So I'm going to create sashing strips. They're 3 inches wide and the height of my block. I'm going to press and fold them in half. I'm going to put one on the front, raw edges together, one on the back, and then I'm going to sew using a 1/2 inch seam. So normally you would use like a 1/4 inch seam. We're going to use a 1/2 inch seam. Once you do that, to connect them, you're going to butt them together, flip this over, and top stitch. So here we go. I've flipped it over, I have it pinned, and I'm just going to top stitch along here. You can use a blanket stitch. I used a blind hem stitch. You can use any decorative stitch. I also then went back and top stitched this side so that it matched. So you can see that stitching right along here. And that's going to attach all your blocks together. Now once you have a row completed, you're going to use the same technique to attach your rows together. So I just have a long sashing strip here. You can see where I'm ready to attach my next row. 1/2 inch seam, I'll butt up my next row and stitch that down. Now the actual outside borders work a little bit differently. So I'm going to cut lengths of batting, and by the way, I did use fusible batting. And you'll notice that this feels or looks rather stiff, but my final quilt is very soft. This is stiff because there's still water-soluble stabilizer in here, and I'll need to wash it one more time. So I'm going to butt up the edge of my batting. I'm going to use a multi-step zigzag and just zigzag those together. Then I'll place one border on top. I'm not using folded strips this time, and one on the bottom. 1/2 inch seam allowance, and flip that over. So once I have my borders on, I'm going to round off the edges. So I just took a plate and extended this seam line and that one and used those as my guides to trim off the corners. To put the ruffle on, I'm going to show you a different technique than what I used. I actually attached binding strips to my ruffle, and I found out that that was probably not the smartest way to put it on. So what I did was I found a better method, and that's what I'm going to show you. To make the ruffle, I like to use a ruffling foot. This actually makes just little pleats. You have a little gauge here that you can set the number of pleats per stitch, and by controlling that and your stitch length, you can adjust the length of the fullness of your pleats. And this makes adding a ruffle to anything much faster than basting in stitches and gathering by hand. So we'll just imagine that my outer border is on there. I'm going to match the right sides of my ruffle together and just kind of rotate it around that curve. I'm going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam. When I flip that over, then on the back side what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my batting under. When I sew this, I only want to sew through the top and the batting. Don't sew through your backing, so that you can turn your backing under over that seam allowance. You can really make this quilt in just one day. It works up really fast. These are single color designs. They're relatively low stitch count, and it makes a great gift. You will have to wash it if you use the water-soluble backing, and you'll want to wash it too if you use the fusible batting, because that glue too will come out, and then you'll have a nice soft quilt rather than something that feels like a pot holder. So I hope you give this a try. It's available from lindygembroidery.com, and it's called It's a Girl.